wasn't supposed to survive, but he turned their stronghold into ash. Dead men don't breathe. The silence after the explosion was a lie. Beneath the cratered husk of what used to be Outpost Theta 9, under a lattice of broken steel and blackened concrete, something still moved. Air hissed from a fractured rebreather. A gloved hand twitched, then clawed through ash and bone. Cade Voss wasn't dead. He should have been. Protocol dictated, survivors activate beacon code Sigma. Surrender, broadcast coordinates, await retrieval. But Voss had seen what the Zaraki did to prisoners. He'd heard the screams before the feed cut out. He hadn't come back from 10 years in the outer rings to die under a flag of mercy. Pain laced his side where shrapnel had torn through his armor. His HUD flickered, static smeared and useless. Blood slicked the inside of his helmet. Every breath came shallow, wet. He bit down to stop the coughing. Through the visor's cracks he saw the enemy. Tall, fluid, limbs like curved blades. Their armor shimmered with an oily iridescence, bending light the way a mirage twists heat. 3 of them scouted the remains, moving with practiced indifference. They weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for trophies. Voss waited. One moved closer, pausing over a broken crate where the outpost's uplink core had once been. It scanned, then moved on. In the momentary lull, Voss shifted. Each motion screamed. His left arm didn't respond. Dislocated. He dragged his body with his right, sliding beneath the twisted struts of a fallen landing platform. The reek of scorched metal and ozone clogged his senses. There, maintenance shaft 04B, partially covered by debris, unused in decades. He remembered the schematic from his engineering rotation. A punishment detail then, a lifeline now. He reached it, dug bare fingers into the emergency panel. The latch was fused. He ripped at it until his nails tore, then used the edge of a shattered ceramic plate to pry it free. The hatch wheezed open. The last thing he heard before dropping into the darkness was the distant hiss of a Zaraki comlink. They hadn't found him. Yet, the shaft was narrow. Voss slid through blind, boots scraping rust and mold. No lights, no backup power. Only the faint red pulse from a dying auxiliary node 3 levels below. He descended slowly, breath catching with every jolt. Memories pressed in, training drills, laughing with Corin and Taya, the sound of her voice before the first barrage hit. Gone now. All of them. Maybe him too, soon enough. But not yet. He reached the sub-level, flicked a switch on his arm console, a flicker of light. Faint. Enough to see. The underbase was ancient. Forgotten tech lined the walls. Coolant tubes, twisted like exposed veins. Dust and old oil turned the floor slick. This was the outpost's spine, the infrastructure left when everything else got upgraded and abandoned. Voss moved like a ghost, silent, listening. No footsteps yet, no pursuit. But he knew it would come. The Zaraki never left loose ends. At the end of the hall, an emergency access terminal blinked, somehow still alive. He keyed in an override code. The screen flickered. System status critical, manual control available. A schematic unfurled across the display. Power conduits, shield arrays, reactor vents, most offline. But one subsystem still pulsed, the environmental regulators. He stared. The outpost had buried storm control nodes, part of its terraforming fallback. Too unstable to use, too dangerous to dismantle. Perfect. He didn't smile. There was no joy left in him, only the fire. He pulled the access schematics from the terminal and began mapping his route. Each vent, each bypass, each control relay. Every step would be pain. Every mistake, death. He had no backup, no reinforcements, just him, and the storm he was about to wake. Above, the Zeraki marked the outpost as cleared. Below, Cade Voss began to turn their stronghold into a grave. The first relay clicked to life with a sickly hum. Voss crouched beside the rust-choked housing, watching as amber light pulsed through corroded circuits. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. That was all he needed. Each vent he opened brought the storm one breath closer. Each reconnected line was a pulse in the monster he was building. This wasn't about holding ground. It was about making the enemy regret ever stepping foot here. His fingers were slick with blood and coolant. He tore fabric from the inner lining of his suit to bind the worst of the wounds. The rest he ignored. Hurt was a constant now, a drumbeat behind his ribs. He moved through the crawl spaces like a wraith, silent, calculating. He avoided the primary halls, knew better than to rely on old maps. The outpost had shifted from the blast. What was straight was now crooked. What was level tilted into chaos. He passed the bones of old machines and older wars. Crates labeled in languages no longer spoken. Panels etched with colony seals from before the Commonwealth fell. In one forgotten corner, a child's drawing still clung to a wall. A stick figure holding hands with what might have been a dog. Voss paused. Not from sentiment, from rage. They'd called this a non-strategic site, not worth defending, not worth evacuating. They were wrong. The Zeraki's voices reached him again, this time closer. They moved with purpose now. Something had tipped them off. Voss ducked into a vent shaft, flattened his body against cold steel. They passed beneath, unaware. One let out a low trill, like a warbling whistle through broken glass. A command. The other split up. They were searching. Voss waited until their footfalls faded, then slid out. He couldn't risk them finding the relays. Not yet. Not before the pattern was complete. He reached the atmospheric control core 2 hours later. Time had stopped meaning anything. His body worked on spite and instinct. The core was half dead, shield plates warped, control rods exposed, but the interface still recognized his ID. He began the manual override sequence. Each command input by hand, slow, intentional. The system resisted. Too old, too damaged, too afraid. He forced it. Initiating wind protocol. Zeta 4. Air vents hissed. Deep in the earth, turbines stirred. The outpost groaned like something alive. Voss keyed in the fail-safe code and pulled the cable from his wrist port. His HUD flared with errors. He didn't care. The ghost had teeth now. He turned toward the northern shaft. More relays waited. More pain. More death. And the beginning of the end. The floor trembled beneath Voss's boots as he dropped into the secondary utility corridor. The storm protocols had begun to cycle, and the ancient systems weren't happy about it. Pipes vibrated. Vents breathed in unnatural pulses. It was working. He moved fast. Faster than his body liked. Every few steps, his side screamed with pain. The bandage was soaked through. Didn't matter. He wasn't running for safety. He was racing to keep ahead of the storm he'd unleashed. At junction 12K, he stopped. One of the main pressure dampers had failed catastrophically. Superheated mist vented in a slow spiral, painting the corridor in haze. If the Zeraki hadn't heard it yet, they would soon. Voss opened a side panel, found the circuit links, and ripped out the dead fuses. He spliced a bypass using copper wires scavenged from an old comm array. The mist slowed. Not perfect, but it would hold long enough for the next step. He keyed in his code at the auxiliary console. Vent control engaged. More vents opened. Hidden ones. Ones buried during the expansion that no one had touched since the colony era. A map overlaid his HUD, a lattice of release valves and atmospheric surge points. If it went right, the Zeraki would be funneled into predictable paths. If it went wrong, he didn't let the thought finish. Static pinged across his comm port, not from the outpost, from a Zeraki beacon. Brief, glitched, then again stronger. A pattern. They were looking for someone. They were looking for him. An hour later, he watched them from the shadows. A scouting group, 4 of them, agile, armored, lethal. Their iridescent plating shimmered under the flickering corridor lights. One paused, cocking its head like a predator catching scent. Voss didn't move. He was wedged into a side cavity above the bulkhead, hidden by ancient ductwork and grime. They moved on. He dropped silently behind them, slipped through a maintenance hatch, and planted the charge. It wasn't military grade, just 3 pressure cores from discarded mining tools wired to a fuel line and set to proximity trigger. He didn't need a kill. He needed disruption. He slid into a lower shaft and waited. The explosion wasn't loud, but the shockwave threw the Zeraki into chaos. One shrieked, its voice jagged like tearing metal. Another fired blindly into the smoke. Voss was already moving. He skirted around the combat zone, reached a data relay, and uploaded the next segment of the storm program. Phase 2 initiated. He watched as internal temperature readings began to spike. Sector 4's atmosphere surged by 12 degrees in under a minute. Vents reversed flow. A localized hurricane was building underground. Let them breathe smoke and ash. Let them taste fear. He staggered into a side tunnel, dragging his leg. A burn ran the length of his calf. His visor cracked further. He patched it with sealing gel and kept going. Because deep beneath the Stronghold, the storm was still just waking up. The walls of the outpost groaned with pressure, flexing as if the base itself had begun to breathe. Voss limped down a forgotten corridor lined with dust-coated conduits and cracked light panels. He was bleeding again. Somewhere inside, something vital had torn, but he couldn't stop. He passed broken surveillance lenses, each one cracked open like blind eyes. Somewhere the Zeraki were still searching, but now they were whispering. Their language wasn't made for fear, but he could hear it in the cadence, the stuttered clicks, the pauses between words. He had become something else in their minds. Not a survivor, not a soldier, a ghost, a myth. And he planned to haunt them to the last. Voss reached the old reactor hall at sub-level 9. It had once powered surface comms before redundancy upgrades shut it down. Now it would serve as his amplifier. He keyed the console. Power trickled through degraded lines, enough to light a central screen. Data pulsed faintly. Atmospheric saturation in the outer corridors had reached critical mass. He opened another valve. Pressure vented with a roar. The temperature dropped 5 degrees, then rose 7. The system howled. He patched his sound feed through the old PA loop. No words, just the echo of dragging metal, recorded hours ago when a support beam had fallen during a fight. Let them hear the ghost. The trap came together in Section Delta 2. He lured a squad in using motion pings from a stolen Zeraki scout drone. They advanced in full formation, tight, efficient, disciplined. Exactly what he wanted. As they crossed the pressure seam, Voss triggered a counterflow burst. Air reversed at blistering speed. 2 were thrown off their feet. 1 lost grip on his weapon. Then came the fire. Plasma cells he'd rigged from a maintenance torch ruptured in sequence. The flash melted armor, splattered iridescent plating across the walls. He watched from a ventilation slit, unmoving. 3 lay dead. 1 crawled toward a fallen beacon, his voice a wet rattle. Voss waited until he was close, then activated a speaker node. Still think this base belongs to you? The soldier froze. And then he ran. The map in Voss's HUD flickered. The base had reshaped itself. Fires, collapses, sealed bulkheads. It was a labyrinth now. He didn't need a way out. He needed one more detonation. He reached a flooded junction and waded through knee-high coolant. Static sparked along the walls. He reached a relay, hands trembling, and keyed the final sequence. Phase 3. Initiate. The lights went out. Everywhere. Above, the Zaraki moved slower. The air fought them. Heat shifted randomly. Pressure pockets burst. The storm had grown teeth. And in its center, the ghost hunted. Smoke slithered down the corridor like a living thing, curling around the corners of ancient piping and shattered bulkheads. Voss moved through it with the precision of a shadow, slow, measured, silent. His breath came in short hisses, every intake strained against the crack in his ribs. He had made the base bleed. Now it was time to carve out its heart. The central core was 5 levels down, buried beneath a slab of reactor shielding and forgotten protocols. No one was supposed to access it without clearance from Colonial Command, a command that hadn't existed in years. That made it perfect. Voss bypassed a collapsed stairwell by crawling along a collapsed ventilation shaft, his knees scraping metal, his hands numb from shock. Below, flickers of alien light danced along the floor as another Zaraki patrol passed. He froze. One wrong sound, one slip of breath, and they'd be on him. But they didn't look up. He descended again. When he reached the core doors, they were fused. Not by time, by sabotage. Someone had tried to bury the past. He didn't ask why. He just tore through the panel, sparked an arc cutter against the seals, and pushed until the doors screamed open. Inside, the air was dense with forgotten power. Dust clung to his visor like memory. Giant capacitors lined the walls, long drained, but still humming faintly with stored energy. In the center, the core relay, a monolithic terminal wrapped in fiber line and forgotten commands. He limped forward. The console flickered, asking for authentication. He gave it an old engineer's override, something from years ago, something they never erased. The system accepted. Core access granted. Data unfurled before him like a resurrection. Base-wide environmental schematics, emergency control overlays, storm protocol regulators, and a countdown. Not his. The Zaraki had triggered a failsafe. The base was going to self-purge in 2 hours. Voss stared, not in shock, not in fear. In fury. He hadn't crawled through fire, hadn't turned terror into tactics, just to have the enemy erase the evidence. He overrode the purge protocol, locking it behind 5 layers of manual keys. Then he rerouted the core's energy into one last directive. Barrier collapse initiated. If they wanted to run, they'd have nowhere to go. He set the charge in the base's ventilation nexus, a blast big enough to blow out the upper exhaust grids. Then he linked it to pressure sensors along the Zaraki fallback lanes. Every step they took would bring them closer to the fire, and he would be watching. The first scream echoed down the corridor like a metal blade dragged across stone. Voss crouched behind the fractured bulk of a collapsed transport lift, watching the Zaraki break formation. They triggered the pressure grid, just as planned. The resulting detonation had torn through their rear lines, scattering armor and boiling coolant into the vents. Panic was a rare thing for the Zaraki, but it bloomed now, ugly and wild. They hadn't come for war, they came to claim. They thought the outpost had died with the first strike, that nothing human could have survived the orbital barrage. They were right, except Cade Voss didn't survive. He adapted. He became something else. And now they were learning what that meant. Static trembled across the base-wide audio grid. Voss activated a pulse from an old comm relay, sending a burst of feedback through their sensors. The effect was immediate. Blinded, several units fired on each other in confusion. He moved with precision, ducking low, slipping between collapsed halls and the shadows of broken infrastructure. The vents hissed around him. The storm above was beginning to breach into the lower sectors. The atmosphere flickered. He reached one of the outer catwalks of the upper defense ring. From here, he had a view of the northeast fallback channel, a narrow pass between two collapsed plating walls. It was the only clear retreat left for the Zeraki ground forces. He activated the last array of directional plasma charges. They ignited with a blinding roar, channeling wind, heat, and radiation into a blade of force. The pass disappeared in a burst of flame and shock waves. Voss saw limbs scatter, heard the wail of ruptured armor, and then silence. Back inside, the Zeraki command node fractured. Intercepted audio feeds burst with layered alien tones. Desperation, command disintegration, and the shriek of a commander being cut down by his own. They were breaking. Voss limped into the central maintenance shaft. He could barely walk now, one eye swollen shut, blood soaking his side. But he had one more job. The final tower, northwest quadrant. He keyed into the old artillery uplink, bypassed safeties, and synchronized targeting to the command spire's base. "Let's finish this," he rasped. He triggered the charge. From above, the last defense turret roared to life. It punched a hole through the command tower's foundation, and the entire structure folded inward like a dying star. Fire bloomed in the sky. And for the first time since the invasion began, the Zeraki ran. They didn't regroup. They fled. The storm hadn't stopped. It had matured. Outside, wind screamed through fractured hulls, carrying with it the sting of ion-charged dust and broken dreams. The upper atmosphere roiled in unnatural patterns, remnants of terraforming systems Voss had twisted into weapons. Below, the outpost no longer resembled a stronghold. It was a carcass. And Cade Voss was nearly part of it. He leaned against a decommissioned coolant main, gasping. Every breath was a blade. His HUD was gone, cracked into silence. Blood soaked his undersuit. A wound in his side leaked warmth down his leg. He didn't have hours left. Maybe not even minutes. But the base was his. His to burn. His to bury. From a fractured viewport, he saw the last of the Zeraki ships punching through low orbit. They left in streaks of white fire, scattered and desperate. No formation. No order. Voss reached for the old command panel. It sparked against his fingertips. He winced, gritted his teeth, and finished keying the broadcast signal. It was short, primitive. Outposts secured. Hostiles retreated. Survivor present. Need extraction. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. Didn't care if it ever came. He'd done his part. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. He drifted in and out. Faces came and went, ghosts from a dozen lifetimes. Taya laughing on the barracks roof. Corin showing him how to splice a relay faster. The officer who told him he'd never make it off Juno alive. They were all gone. And soon, maybe he would be too. But then, a hum. Distant, familiar. Dropship thrusters. His fingers twitched. He tried to sit up. Couldn't. Tried again. Managed a grunt. The hatch blew open seconds later. Light poured in. Figures moved. Armor, visors, red earth insignias. Human. "Contact, we've got him!" Hands grabbed him, lifted him. A medic's voice filtered through the blur. "Vitals faint, but he's alive. Jesus, he held this whole place himself?" Someone leaned close. "What's your name, soldier?" He cracked one eye open. "Cade Voss." "You did good, Voss. Real good. We're taking you home. He blinked once, smiled faintly. Then the dark took him. The med bay was quiet save for the hum of monitors. Cade Voss floated in and out of sleep, tethered to life by wires, patches, and whispered updates he couldn't quite process. His body was broken, ribs fractured, muscles torn, burns across nearly a third of his skin. But he was alive. Barely. Outside, the fleet orbited what was left of Juno 7. Debrief reports called the recovery zone a partial salvage. Engineers said it was a miracle anything remained at all. But those who stepped foot into the ruins didn't speak in military terms. They spoke in awe. They spoke of scorched halls humming with residual heat, of turrets still tracking air like they waited for ghosts, of the command console, one last directive still blinking. They spoke of a name carved into the wall beside it. Voss. The admiral visited once, brief, stern. But when he looked down at Voss, unconscious beneath layers of regeneration mesh, his voice softened. Why, get this man anything he needs. He turned to the lead med tech, and when he wakes up, tell him the storm won. Weeks later, Cade opened his eyes to a ceiling of sterile light. The pain was muted now, managed, but the memories stayed sharp. He didn't ask what happened to the Zaraki. He knew. He didn't ask if the base was recovered. It wasn't his anymore. He asked for one thing, a quiet room, a glass of water, and a schematic of the outpost. Why? The nurse asked, confused. He smiled, voice rasping through healing lungs. I need to build something better. Not for revenge, not for war, for memory, for warning. Because the storm had passed, but its shadow remained. And legends he knew weren't written in peace. They were forged in ash.